When I first bought that old off-grid cabin in the Montana woods, I thought the hardest part of this journey was going to be rebuilding a place time had forgotten. The listing photos showed a leaning porch, cracked windows, and a roof that sagged like it was carrying the whole way to the sky. I knew I'd be dealing with broken boards, stubborn nails, and a chimney that probably hadn't seen a fire since the 90s. And honestly, I was excited. I'd spent years dreaming about escaping the noise, fixing up a little place where the only deadlines are the ones I set for myself. A quiet corner of the world where I could breathe again. So when I turned down that dusty road for the first time with a truck full of tools, I felt like I was finally stepping into the life I'd been chasing. The trees opened up like a curtain, revealing the cabin exactly as it looked online. Weathered, tired, but still standing. That alone felt like a small miracle. I packed, took a deep breath of crisp mountain air, and felt this wave of peace wash over me. I remember saying out loud, "All right, let's bring you back to life." I spent that first day cleaning out old furniture, sweeping out piles of leaves that had blown inside, and sketching out which repairs I wanted to start with. Every crack and creak felt like a conversation with the past owner. I even found a note stuffed behind the kitchen drawer, just a scribbled reminder about picking up lumber. Nothing meaningful, but still enough to make me feel connected to whoever worked on this place before me. And for a while, everything was perfect. The kind of perfect you get in those rare moments in life where everything feels right, even the broken parts. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the creek flow somewhere behind the tree line. No cars, no neighbors, no interruptions, just peace. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning, just before sunrise, I heard an engine rumble down the road. I figured it was a lost hunter, or maybe someone from the county checking the fire lines. I didn't think anything of it. But when the vehicle slowed down and stopped right at the end of my driveway, something in my chest tightened. It was a black SUV, one of those big, spotless ones that look out of place on a dirt road. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I stepped outside, curious but cautious. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out wearing a uniform that didn't match anything I recognized. Dark green shirt, heavy-duty boots, and a badge that looked like it had been printed off the internet and stuck onto a metal clip. He stood with his hand resting near his hip, uncomfortably close to what looked like a holster. "Morning," I said, trying to keep it friendly. He didn't smile. "You can't be here," he said flatly. "This is private HOA property." I actually let out a short laugh, because the idea was ridiculous. "I think you've got the wrong spot," I said. "This is my land. Bought it legally. Cabin included." He shook his head like he'd heard that excuse 1,000 times. "You need to leave immediately. You're trespassing." Everything in his tone was rehearsed, like he was reading off a script he'd memorized. But it was the way he stared at me, cold, unblinking, that made my stomach drop. This wasn't some confused local. This was someone sent here with a purpose. "I have the deed inside," I said slowly. "I can show you right now." He raised his hand slightly. "Doesn't matter. You're in violation. Our board will contact you." "Board?" I repeated. "There's no HOA within miles of here." He didn't answer. He just glanced around my cabin like he was scanning it, like he was already planning what to do with it once I was gone. Then he got back into the SUV and drove off without another word. I stood there for a long time after he disappeared, trying to make sense of what just happened. The forest was silent again, but the peace was gone. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I came out there expecting to rebuild a cabin. I never expected I'd have to defend it. The following afternoon, just when I started convincing myself the first encounter had been some bizarre misunderstanding, 2 more SUVs appeared. Different colors this time, one white, one gray, but the same style, the same tinted windows, the same slow, intimidating crawl down my driveway. For a moment, I just stood there with my hammer in my hand, wondering how in the world any HOA would even know I existed out here. You couldn't stumble onto my cabin by accident. The road didn't connect to anything. There were no mailboxes, no houses, not even a sign. You had to know it was here. And that meant someone was talking. The doors opened, and 2 men stepped out wearing matching shirts with some logo stitched on the chest. It wasn't an official agency, more like a made-up design meant to look legitimate. They moved with that same stiff confidence I'd seen in the first guy, the kind of posture meant to make you doubt yourself before they even speak. "Sir, we had reports of trespassing in this area," the taller one announced. His voice carried this tone like he was doing me a favor by telling me. I set my hammer down and walked toward them. "Trespassing? I'm standing on my land. I just bought this place." The shorter man unfolded a stack of papers and thrust them at me. "This entire section falls under our HOA jurisdiction. Renovations, structural changes, and long-term stays require board approval." I stared at him, genuinely bewildered. "There's no HOA out here. This is private land, off-grid land. I checked every boundary before purchasing." He didn't flinch. "Our records say otherwise." Something in me snapped a little at that. Not loud anger, just a cold, shaking disbelief. I'd dealt with bureaucracy before. I'd dealt with nosy neighbors. But this wasn't either of those things. This was people trying to assert power where they had none. I flipped through the papers they'd handed me. They were covered in official-looking seals that didn't match any of the county logos I'd seen during the buying process. The text was sloppy, full of strange rules about community expectations and enforcement procedures. Half the paragraphs didn't even make sense. It looked like a bad attempt at copying real HOA documents, just enough white space and bold text to appear intimidating to someone who didn't know better. But I knew better. "These aren't real," I said finally. The taller man crossed his arms. "Failure to comply will result in escalating enforcement actions." Something about the phrase escalating enforcement made the hair on my neck stand up. These men weren't confused. They weren't lost. They weren't doing routine patrols. They were here with one purpose: push me off my own land. After they left, I spent the rest of the day pacing the cabin, reading every line of those papers. The more I read, the more obvious it became. None of this was backed by law. None of it was even professionally written. But the boldness they had, the authority they pretended to have, that was dangerous. People with fake power often acted worse than people with real power. As night fell, the woods felt different, heavier. Every sound made me jump, branches cracking, an owl hooting, even the wind brushing against the cabin walls. I'd chosen this place because of the isolation, but now that isolation felt like a weakness. No neighbors nearby, no streetlights, no one to call out to. If those men decided to push harder, there wouldn't be anyone around to witness it. Around 9 p.m., as I was trying to calm myself down, there was a soft knock on the door. My heart jumped into my throat. But when I opened it, I found an older man standing on my porch, wearing a dusty jacket and holding a lantern. His name was Mark. He lived a few miles down the ridge, one of the few year-round residents out here. "I heard they came by," he said quietly. His expression told me he already knew everything. I nodded. "Who are they?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice like the trees might be listening. "They're from the new development over near Pine Ridge. Their HOA's been trying to expand their territory, if you can call it that. They think if they pressure enough folks, they can claim the land as part of their community." I felt my stomach twist. "So they're just making it up?" "Pretty much," he said. "Some people got scared and moved. Others sold cheap. They are hoping you'll do the same." That conversation changed everything. It wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a planned effort to force me off my own property for their benefit. As I locked my door that night, a new feeling settled into my chest. Not fear, not anger, but determination. They wanted me alone and intimidated. But now I knew what they were doing. I knew what they wanted. And I knew I wasn't backing down. Over the next few days, things went from irritating to genuinely threatening. At first, I tried to convince myself a situation would calm down if I just ignored them. I focused on fixing the porch, replacing old floorboards, hauling rotten wood out of the shed. I kept my head down. I minded my business. I told myself these people would eventually realize I wasn't scared and they'd leave me alone. But intimidation doesn't work that way. Bullies don't stop when you ignore them. If anything, it makes them push harder. And that's exactly what happened. The first escalation came early one morning when I walked out to grab tools from my truck. A bright red notice was nailed to a pine tree at the edge of my property. The paper was laminated, like they planned for it to withstand the rain. In bold letters, it said, "Violation notice, unauthorized occupation of property. Report to HOA enforcement immediately." There was no number, no address, no contact information, just a warning. I ripped it down, but they put up two more the next day, one on my porch, one on the cabin door itself. The goal of it made my blood boil. A day later, I woke up to find orange cones blocking my road. Not near the highway, not even somewhere reasonable. They were placed right at the boundary of my land, like the world beyond that point belonged to them. And standing beside them was a man in the same fake uniform from before, arms crossed, like a guard on duty. He didn't say a word when I approached. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just stood there, watching. That's when the fear started turning into anger. I grabbed the cones and tossed them aside. He didn't stop me, but he didn't move either. He just stared with his cold, empty look that made me wonder what exactly he'd been told about me. Because this wasn't about rules or violations. This was about power. And people who want power more than anything else tend to justify anything to get it. But nothing compared to what I found 2 days later. A brand new metal gate had been installed across the road, on my land, welded shut. They didn't even bother pretending it wasn't theirs. A heavy padlock hung from the latch like they were daring me to challenge them. I stood there for a full minute, stunned. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, pure disbelief. Who did they think they were? What gave them the right to put a barrier on land they didn't own, land they didn't control, land they had no claim to whatsoever? I went back to my shed, grabbed my grinder, and marched straight back to the gate. Sparks flew as a metal screamed and snapped apart. The second the gate hit the gate, an SUV came skidding around a bend, gravel spraying everywhere. 3 men jumped out, shouting before the engine even died. "What do you think you're doing?" the leader yelled. "Fixing my road," I shouted back. "You're destroying HOA property. We can have you arrested." The way they closed the distance between us made my pulse spike. They were inches from my face, crowding around like they wanted to box me in. The leader stepped so close I could see the tiny scratches on his fake badge. He was taller, heavier, and radiating the kind of confidence you see in people who believe no one will ever challenge them. "For what?" I said, raising my voice. "For accessing my own land? For removing a gate you put on property that's not yours." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might actually lunge at me. "Back away," he said coldly. "You're crossing a line." "No," I said. "You crossed at the moment you stepped onto my land." That answer must have thrown him, because he blinked. The confidence wavered. Just for a second. They argued for another few minutes, tossing around empty threats about fines and legal action. When that didn't work, they resorted to insults, trying to provoke me. But eventually they realized I wasn't giving in. They backed off, one by one, muttering under their breath as they stumped back to the SUV. I thought that would be the end of it, but that night proved me wrong. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard the first sound, a slow, heavy step on my porch. Then another, then the unmistakable rattle of my door handle. I froze. My heart thundered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, held it tight, and quietly reached for the hatchet I'd been using earlier in the day. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just listened. Boots scraped across the wood. A flashlight beam cut across my window. The figure lingered, circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the darkness. I stayed awake until sunrise, every muscle tense, every sound magnified. That was the moment everything changed for me. They weren't trying to scare me anymore. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could go while I was isolated and alone. But that night taught me something they didn't intend. They were escalating because they thought no one would hold them accountable. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was alone. And that meant it was time to prove them wrong. I woke up the next morning feeling exhausted but strangely focused. The fear from the night before hadn't disappeared. It had hardened into something sharper. Determination. If they wanted to act like no one would see what they were doing, fine. I'd make sure the world could see every second of it. So I drove into town and bought everything I could think of. Trail cameras, batteries, extra SD cards, motion detectors, solar chargers, even a couple of those small wildlife cams hunters use. I must have looked paranoid loading all that gear into my truck, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to spend another night wondering who was creeping around my cabin in the dark. By noon, I had cameras strapped to trees, tucked under roof eaves, and mounted on posts near the driveway. I even camouflaged some with pine branches so well that I had trouble finding them again. Every camera was synced to automatically upload footage the second it was triggered. If those men showed up again, there'd be no denying what they were doing. Not this time. And like clockwork, they did. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard engines rumbling up my road. 2 SUVs again. Same dark tint. Same fake uniforms. Same aggressive posture like they owned every inch of the ground they stepped on. I didn't rush outside. I wanted the cameras to catch them at their most confident, the way they always acted when they believed they weren't being recorded. By the time I stepped onto the porch, they were already marching toward me, papers in hand, voices loud and commanding. "We need to speak with you," one of them shouted. I didn't respond. I simply pointed to the nearest camera strapped to a pine tree. A little red light blinked steadily. "What's that?" the other man demanded. "Keep talking," I said calmly. Their reactions were immediate and priceless. They froze mid-step, eyes darting toward the cameras like someone had just shined a spotlight on all their secrets. The leader squinted up at the lens, then back at me, his confidence thinning like mist under sunlight. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat, "you don't have permission to record us." I smiled, not out of amusement, but out of finally feeling like I had some control. "Funny," I said, "because you've been recording me, right? With your chest cams." He stiffened. He hadn't expected that. They always wore those little clipped-on devices, pretending they were official, pretending they had a right to document everything I did on my own property. "That's different," he protested. "We're conducting an inspection. On land you don't own, enforcing rules that don't exist," I replied. "And now you're on camera. So go ahead, explain your authority." Silence. Thick, uncomfortable silence. The shorter guard took a step back. The leader looked around like he was suddenly aware of how many lenses were pointed at him. One on the cabin wall, one in the tree, one behind him, blinking from under a fallen log. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "No," I said. "I'm documenting one." They exchanged glances, obviously communicating something silently. For the first time since this nightmare began, I watched them hesitate. Their shoulders weren't squared anymore. Their hands weren't hovering near their belts. Even their voices dropped. "We were just checking on a report," the shorter man said weakly. "Someone claimed there was an authorized construction here." I raised an eyebrow. "And that gives you permission to trespass?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. They were unraveling. They knew it. I knew it. The cameras knew it. Within another minute, they were retreating, fast. They backed toward their SUVs, trying to act casual but failing miserably. The leader muttered something about needing to verify documentation, and then they were gone, tires spinning as they sped back down the road. For the first time in days, I exhaled fully. I felt something shift inside me, not just relief, but power. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't cornered. And I wasn't alone anymore, not with the cameras watching every inch of my property. Later that night, I sat in my cabin reviewing the footage. Every angle captured their arrival, their threats, their discomfort the moment they realized everything was being recorded. Seeing them squirm on video felt surreal. These were the same men who'd stood inches from my face, shouting, threatening, trying to force me off land they had no claim to. Now they looked like scared kids caught doing something they shouldn't. I uploaded the clips to a secure drive, organized each encounter by date, and backed them up twice. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. People like that didn't just walk away. They regrouped, they recalculated, and they tried again from another angle. But what they didn't realize was that something had changed permanently. The moment that first red recording light blinked, the power dynamic flipped. They couldn't hide, couldn't intimidate in the dark, couldn't twist the situation to make me look like the problem. They thought I was just one person in the woods. But now, they were the ones under surveillance. They were the ones who had to be careful. They were the ones who finally looked afraid. And as I watched the last clip, showing them speeding away with their fake badges and fake authority, I understood something important. The truth was finally on my side, and this time, I had proof. For a few days after the cameras went up, the woods felt strangely calm. No SUVs rolling in unannounced, no cones blocking my road, no more laminated threats taped to my door. It was almost eerie, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Part of me hoped the footage had scared them enough to back off permanently. But the other part, the part that had already seen how far they were willing to go, knew better. People who crave control don't disappear just because a camera catches them acting like bullies. They regroup. So I kept repairing the cabin, kept checking the cameras, kept expecting the next move. And it finally came, just not in the way I expected. One morning, while I was clearing brush near the property line, I heard footsteps approaching. Not stomping, not marching, just slow, steady steps. When I turned, I saw an older woman walking toward me, hands raised, palms open, like she didn't want me to think she was a threat. She wore a simple flannel shirt, jeans, and carried a binder tucked under her arm. She didn't look like the others, which put me slightly at ease, but not enough to let my guard down. "You're the new owner, right?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost sad. I am," I said cautiously. She nodded. "My name's Helen. Well, I guess you could say I used to be part of the HOA you've been dealing with." That made every part of me tense immediately. "I'm not here to threaten you," she added quickly. "I'm here because things have gotten out of hand." I didn't respond. I just watched her. She opened the binder, revealing dozens of documents, maps, complaint forms, what looked like minutes from HOA meetings, even emails printed out in long chains. She flipped through them with shaking hands. "Most of us never agreed to any of this," she said. "The intimidation, the fake enforcement, the guards. That wasn't supposed to happen." I folded my arms. "But it did." "Yes," she whispered, guilt-heavy in her voice. "Because a few people on the board became obsessed with expanding the development. They wanted more land, more control, more money, and they didn't care who they hurt to get it." She handed me a paper, a map showing the HOA boundary. The real one, the actual county-approved document. My land wasn't just outside their boundary. It was miles outside it. They had no authority here. None. Not even close. "They've done this before," she continued. "Two families left because they felt unsafe. They sold their property for almost nothing. The board bought both parcels. So that was their plan. Bullying, fear, pressure, then swoop in and buy the land cheap. It made my stomach turn. "I'm done with them," she said firmly. "And I want to help you. You're not the only one they've targeted. People are finally getting tired of it." I didn't fully trust her yet, but her presence didn't feel like a trap. She wasn't armed, she wasn't aggressive, and she didn't try to push into my space. She just stood there with paperwork and a tired expression, like someone who'd watched something good decay over time and finally couldn't ignore it. She asked if I'd be willing to meet others who felt the same way. After everything I'd been through, I wasn't eager to surround myself with anyone connected to that HOA. But I also knew fighting a group alone wasn't easy. So I agreed to listen. We set a meeting for the next day at the edge of the forest near a small clearing. When I arrived, there were 6 people waiting, ordinary residents from the development. Some looked nervous. Others looked ashamed. But every single one of them seemed fed up. They shared their stories. How the board president had threatened fine for minor things. How security patrolled at night with no oversight. How dissenting voices were silenced. How the board kept expanding its influence in ways that weren't even legal. And then they told me something that changed everything. They wanted to take their HOA to court. They just didn't have the evidence. I did. Footage, audio, documents they'd given me, maps, records of intimidation. All of it. For the first time since this mess began, I felt the tables turn. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through unity. These people weren't my enemies. They were victims too. And now they were standing with me instead of against me. In the weeks that followed, we gathered more documentation, filed reports with the county, and submitted complaints to the state. The investigation that opened was bigger than anyone expected. Turns out, the security guards weren't licensed. The documents they issued weren't legal. The board was misusing funds. And the attempted land grab? That was the final nail in the coffin. It took months, but justice eventually came. The corrupt board was removed. Charges were filed. The fake security force was shut down. And the HOA itself was placed under state supervision until a new board could be elected. As for my cabin, it stood tall through it all, stronger, safer, and finally mine in every sense. When I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the pines, something in me softened. This place, which had once been the center of fear and chaos, now felt peaceful again. Not because the danger was gone, but because I realized something important. Standing alone is hard. Standing together changes everything. In the end, that was a real lesson. Not just perseverance, not just courage, but unity. Because when people refuse to be intimidated and choose to stand up together, even the strongest bully doesn't stand a chance.